I think we're ready for the last of our talks for today. So I want to bring in our last guest. I see him backstage, and welcome Mark Erikson to the stream. Mark, how's it going?
Hi, doing pretty good.
Cool. Why don't you tell people that don't know you, who you are, what you do, all that good sort of stuff.
Okay, well, I've actually got I've got my standard introductory spiel lined up on the slides. If you want to,
yeah, let's just good logical segue. There you go.
All right. So hi, I'm Mark Erikson, and today I'll be talking about Modern Redux with Redux Toolkit. So for those of you who don't know me, got to make sure I'm actually focused on the correct screen here. I am an answer of questions. I will happily answer questions about React and Redux basically anywhere there is a text box on the internet. I collect all kinds of interesting links, tools, utilities, React and Redux articles, libraries, anything that looks like it might be useful down the road. I write very, very long blog posts about React and Redux related topics. I am a Redux maintainer, and I'm also that guy with the Simpsons avatar.
Phenomenal. Couldn't have done it any better.
So yeah, I'm good to go with the rest of this stuff. Any questions before we get started?
Where did the Simpsons avatar come from? Did you have someone make that, or
No? Okay, so the goofy thing is, like, I'm not even like a Simpsons fan per se. I never even like seriously watched the show, but like, I don't know, like 13, 14 years ago when the Simpsons movie came out, they had a Flash-based make your own Simpsons avatar thing on the website, and someone just happened to link it, and I was playing around with it and made something that at least sort of vaguely resembled me. And I downloaded the picture and I stashed it somewhere. And a few years later, like, I was starting to sign up for, like, you know, GitHub and a couple other places, and I'm like, I don't have a picture to put up. Didn't I make that avatar? So I'm just going to like cut that out, and then it like became a thing.
Yeah, no, I think it captures you quite nicely too, which is kind of, I think, what makes it resonate so well.
Before I went to my first ever actual conference in person, there was sort of a running joke discussion about just how much I would or would not resemble that.
I say you nailed it.
Well, cool. I say dive right in, and we can chime in with questions as they come up. And if you have questions in chat, feel free to chime in, and I'll bring them up as they make sense.
Okay, so the topic today is Modern Redux with Redux Toolkit. But before I get to the actual part of that discussion, I am legally obliged to give my usual talk about the fact that Redux is not actually dead. In the interest of time, I'll skip through the slides pretty fast and not spend much actual time here. But the standard talking points are Redux is still used by around half of all React apps. It's still by far the most widely used React state management library at all, used by all kinds of big apps. It's not going away anytime soon. If you look at the download stats, the numbers keep actually going up in real terms. It is definitely overused, and my standard advice is for any tool, take time to consider why you're actually using it and what problems it solves. Don't just blindly grab for anything because someone said you ought to use it or because you saw it in a tutorial. And just because you see someone say on Twitter that a thing is dead does not actually make it so.
Man, I can't handle all these facts dropping.
Oh, wait, we're just getting started. The timing on this one's interesting because we just had a very good talk about GraphQL. A thing that comes up a lot is, like, does GraphQL replace Redux? And it's not about GraphQL specifically. It's about whether you are primarily using Redux just to fetch or just to store cache data. And if you choose to use a tool whose primary purpose is to fetch and cache data, like an Apollo, an Urkel, a React query, or so on. If that's the case, then in that situation, no, you probably don't need Redux. But there are some further aspects to this we'll get to in a minute. The other big one that I hear a lot is that context can replace Redux, and this one is really a confusion over what context and Redux do. Redux is a state management tool. Context is a dependency injection tool, not state management. And I wrote a very extensive article on this entitled, why React Context is not a state management tool, and why it doesn't replace Redux. So I would encourage folks to read through that post to understand the differences between these. One thing I have seen a lot in the last couple of years is that the problem space that the React community in particular is interested in has kind of shifted. In 2015, we were really focused on state management, and you had Flux libraries and Redux coming about because of the problems we'd seen with things like Backbone. Today, people are more interested in data fetching and caching. They don't want to have to like write a lot of logic to track loading state. They just want to say like, here's my URL or my data source, just give me back my data field and my is loading flag and let me render the UI based on that. And we'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. So in general, Redux is alive. It's useful for a lot of things. There are a lot of other very great tools in the ecosystem that solve some of the same problems. So the important thing is to take the time to understand what problems you have in your app, what problems do each of these tools solve, and pick the right tools that actually solve your problems specifically. Okay, so one other thought here is that a lot of times it's hard to know what problems these tools actually solve. And I'm actually kind of trying to get like a new community-driven site off the ground that would have kind of like some opinionated advice and answers on what each of these tools is used for, when you should consider them, when you should not consider them. Right now, it's a semi-placeholder page with just a couple pieces of information on there that I've put together. I haven't had time to get back to this myself, but I'm hoping that in the near future, after we get a couple other things out the door, I'll have some time to get back to this. And I really want the whole community to get involved in this. Like ideally, maintainers of all these different tools would be talking about like, when does it make sense to use MobX or XState, inline styles versus CSS modules, when should I use like, fetch versus Axios, stuff like that. And like the goal is to be like a community created resource on when it makes sense to use it and what the available options are.
There's a lot of confusion in the marketplace. I'm sure people would love it.
Oh, tell me about it. That's why I think this is a good idea.
And everybody wants the one true way, which, doesn't exist.
Exactly. Okay, so I've used this phrase modern Redux. What does that even mean? So the way that we encourage people to write Redux today is very different than the way that we encourage people to write Redux even just a couple years ago. And it's several different things working together. It's the use of Redux Toolkit for writing your Redux logic. Redux Toolkit, in turn, relies on a package called Immer to let you write much simpler immutable update logic in your reducers. React Redux has a hooks API instead of the classic connect API. And we're encouraging some better patterns for using Redux together with TypeScrypt. Along with that, we've put together an opinionated set of best practices and recommendations in our docs that we call the Redux Style Guide. And you don't have to follow all these, but we've found that these are things that generally work better and produce better code bases. And so when you put all these factors together, the patterns that we teach today are a lot simpler and easier to learn and use than what you've probably seen in almost all other Redux tutorials and even stuff written relatively recently. So let's look at the things that make up this modern Redux idea. So first off, React Redux. We put out version 7 in early 2019, and this kind of changed some of our fundamental internal architecture. And without going into the nitty-gritty details, it made things faster, and it laid a foundation for us to build some newer pieces on top of the code base. And the biggest thing that we did was we implemented a hooks API for React Redux. So the React team announced hooks in the fall of 2018, and like 30 seconds later, people were filing issues on our repository saying like, React Redux hooks, when? And we had to get version 7 out the door first to provide the technical foundation, but then we had to figure out like, what are these hooks even going to look like? And there was a whole series of issue threads and discussions that had hundreds of comments where we debated technical constraints, naming conventions, API designs, And we finally settled on really just two hooks, useSelector and useDispatch. So we put this out in version 7.1 in the summer of 2019. And we now actually recommend the hooks API as the default approach for working with React and working with the Redux store in your React components. Connect still works fine. We're not removing it. Your code's not going to break. But we've found that the hooks API is typically easier for people to use and learn. Now, there are some different trade-offs when you use hooks instead of connect. And I've talked about that in some of my blog posts and conference talks. So what are these hooks? Well, the useSelector hook allows you to extract data from the Redux store for use in your component. For example, if I have like a list of blog posts and I need to read the state.post data from the store, I can call the useSelector hook, pass in a small selector function, and just extract the one piece of data that I actually need. Like connect, it's kind of similar to the map state argument, and it subscribes to the store so that if this data ever changes, your components will re-render, but it's simpler to use. And like you look at it, it's pretty obvious what this does. With connect, we found that a lot of times people were confused about how, like, where is that data coming from? Like, how am I getting this as a prop in my component? We also have a useDispatch hook, and this is a little bit like the map dispatch argument to connect, but it's pretty simple. Like literally all it does is it gives you the store's dispatch function. And then it's up to you to call that inside of like a click handler or something to dispatch the correct action. So there's actually a little bit less of an abstraction here because you're no longer like binding action creators. So in one sense, you're writing just a little bit more code, but it's also a lot more clear what's actually happening because there's no abstraction here. So right now, we're on version 7.2. It's stable. We don't have any real plans for immediate changes. Long term, the bigger questions are React concurrent mode and suspense and some of the future React capabilities. We're really waiting on the React team to kind of release some public alpha and beta versions of that functionality to really see exactly how we're going to be able to best integrate with that. It's possible there will be some limitations, but we'll do our best to address those once we have some actual code to work with.
We might be waiting for a while. It's unless you have any inside info that they haven't released publicly.
Insert the obligatory suspense joke here.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. So if you want to know more about how React Redux works, I've written an extensive article on my blog that talks about what is the job of React Redux, how does it work internally, why have we had multiple versions, how has it changed. It goes into a lot of detail that helps clarify what it actually does for you. So let's talk about Redux Toolkit. And this is really the centerpiece of what we call modern Redux. So if you look at all the discussion about Redux over the years, there have been a lot of different complaints about it. The word you typically hear is boilerplate, and boy, do I hate that word at this point. But there's been a lot of very justified complaints. It's things like it's too hard to set up a Redux store. I have to call all these extra functions like apply middleware and compose and that weird window DevTools extension thingy. And like I keep having to like, it's too easy to make mistakes with immutable updates. And I keep having to write all this extra code like action creators and action types. It's painful. And those were very valid concerns. So we've tried to address those by creating an official package called Redux Toolkit. And this was really inspired by things like createReact app. Like you could always set up Babel and Webpack by hand, but it was a pain and no one wanted to do it. And there was value in having an official standardized approach that did all that work for you and gave you a good default setup. So Redux Toolkit is much the same way. It's a set of APIs that simplify standard Redux setup and usage practices, and it provides a lot of good default behavior baked in automatically. We put out version 1.0 in late 2019. We originally called it Redux Starter Kit, but renamed it to Redux Toolkit to reduce confusion. And it's written in TypeScrypt, and it's designed to really simplify a lot of TypeScrypt usage patterns. And it's really meant to be useful for all Redux users, whether you're someone learning Redux for the first time or you've been using it for years. And I especially want to give a shout out to my co-maintainer, Lens Weber, who's done most of the development on the APIs over the last year and a half, as well as Matt Sikowski, who's contributed a lot to the docs and the tests. So what's in the box? Well, the first API is something called configureStore. And this is a small function that wraps around the Redux basic createStore method. So the idea is you call configureStore, and you can pass in your individual slice reducer functions, and it's automatically going to do a bunch of work for you. It's going to set up the Redux DevTools extension by default so that you can see your state in development. It's going to automatically add the ReduxThunk middleware because that's what most people use for async logic. It also adds some middleware that catch common mistakes, like accidentally mutating data. And you can either pass in a root reducer function yourself or pass in the individual slices, and it will automatically combine all of them for you. So with this one fairly simple function call, we get a well-configured Redux store with good defaults. This also has a bunch of additional options that you can use to mess with the configuration. You can pass in additional middleware. You can configure when the dev tools are actually enabled. You can pass in additional Redux store enhancers or some initial state values. So it's all the same kinds of configuration that you've always been able to do, but it's actually easier to work with because it's now passed as a named options object, and it does the final assembly kind of internally for you. So one of the biggest pain points with working with Redux has been writing immutable update logic. The problem is JavaScript by default is mutable. You have to work and do extra effort to make immutable updates. And so typically this means writing a bunch of nested spread operators and array mapping and concatenating and slicing, all that stuff by hand. And it's long and it's hard to read and it's really easy to make mistakes. So Michelle Westrate, the author of MobX, created a very powerful library called Immer. And Immer offers a single function called produce, and you pass in your original data as the first argument, and then you pass in a callback. And the callback receives a value that looks like your original data, but inside of the callback, it is safe to mutate that draft value because it's actually been wrapped in an ES6 proxy object. And so
we've had Immer come up at least 3 times today.
It's
so I'm
that
glad
awesome.
It's the 4th. Yeah, it sounds
that
like it's
awesome.
great.
So Immer drastically simplifies writing immutable update logic, and it basically eliminates accidental mutations entirely. So Redux Toolkit has been built around Immer from day one. And the next API that we have is something called createReducer. Half the development world hates writing switch statements. And you've never had to write switch statements to use Redux, but it's in most of the examples. So almost everyone has written their own version of a lookup table utility where the keys are the action types and the values are the case reducer functions. So we've got one of those in Redux Toolkit, except it uses Immer inside. And so you can write case reducer functions that mutate the data, and as long as you pass them to createReducer with Immer's magic inside, that's safe. So that drastically simplifies the logic for writing updates in your reducers. We also have a function called createAction. This is actually kind of more like a createAction creator function, but that's just kind of hard to say. So you pass in an action type string, and it generates a function for you that takes a payload value as its argument and generates the action object. So this at least simplifies a little bit of the process that you could use and that you would typically do. But in practice, you won't actually call createReducer or createSlice in your own code. or sorry, createReducer or createAction, because we have a method called createSlice. And this is really the bread and butter of writing modern Redux logic. So you call createSlice and you pass in a string name field and some initial state. Then you provide an object called reducers whose keys are strings and whose values are reducer functions. And like createReducer, this uses Immer inside, but it actually automatically takes the names of the reducer functions that you provided and it generates corresponding action creators for each of those reducers. So all I had to do was name my reducer user updated, and I get an action creator with the same name and the correct action type for free. And if you're using TypeScrypt and you specified the type of the action object, the action creator has the correct type for its argument as well. So at this point, action types basically become an implementation detail. You don't write them by hand. You don't worry about them. The only time you see them is in the Redux dev tools. And as long as you give your slice and your reducer functions a good name, you get good action type names for free. So this drastically simplifies the amount of code that you have to write to do typical Redux behavior. This also makes it really easy to follow what's known as the Dux pattern or the slice pattern, where you're really actually putting all of your Redux logic in a single file instead of spreading them across many files. Now, you've never been required to split your code across like actions.js and constants.js, reducers.js, and so on. But that's what the documentation and examples showed. So that's what a lot of people did. And here, you basically just call one function, export a couple of variables, and you're done. That's it. So the code's in one place, and it's a lot easier to follow, and you don't have to change a dozen files to update one bit of logic. createSlice has a few extra capabilities. Here in the reducers field, it's generating new action types. But we've always encouraged the pattern of having many different parts of your reducer logic respond to one action at the same time. And so there's also an extra reducers field where you can handle additional action types that were defined outside the slice and update your state here. Maybe you want to reset all your state when the user logs out, or maybe there's like some kind of like a data fetching operation and several pieces need to update at the same time. So the extra reducers field allows that. A lot of people ask, can I add thunks in the middle of my slice? Right now, that's not possible. We would like to do it, but there's unfortunately some TypeScript complications that make it kind of hard. So right now, we recommend defining thunks in that same slice file alongside the reducer logic. Now, we also have a few other things in here. Most Redux apps use the reselect library to generate memoized selector functions for reading data from the store. So we just re-export that same API. We also have a specific API called createAsyncThunk. Now, the typical Redux pattern is you dispatch one action before you make the request so you can track some loading state, and then you dispatch either success or failure afterwards with either the result of the request or an error. And it's annoying to have to write all those action types by hand. It's annoying to keep dispatching the same things every time. So createAsyncThunk does the work of generating the action types and dispatching them based on a payload creation callback that you define. So in this case, we're going to call an API that uses a promise. We're going to fetch a user by ID, wait for the response, return the right field from the API, and it's going to automatically dispatch a pending action before the request, and then either a fulfilled or rejected action after the request. So this saves us the work of having to actually write all those extra action creators by hand. Finally, we've always recommended a pattern called normalizing your state, where instead of storing data in arrays, a lot of times it's helpful to store it in a lookup table where the keys are item IDs and the values are the actual items. Like think of like a to-do list. Like you might want to have each list item take its ID as a prop and then read that one data item from the Redux store based on the ID. And it's a lot easier to do that with a lookup table than it is to loop over an array. But we'd never provided any APIs to help with that. So Redux Toolkit has an API called createEntityAdapter, which provides pre-built reducer logic for managing normalized data in kind of like a CRUD style fashion. So it provides reducers like add one, add many, upsert one or many, set all, remove all, and so on. And you can use these either as reducers by themselves, or you can use them as helper functions within your Immer-powered reducers. It also generates some selector functions to help you get one item by its ID or select the entire array, and it can even keep the array of items in a sorted order for you. So again, these are all typical Redux usage patterns that a lot of people were doing anyway, and Redux Toolkit provides APIs to help simplify a lot of those patterns. But there's one other thing that I'm very, very excited about, and let's see if it next. Okay, sorry, a couple other slides first. I'm really, really excited about this. Okay, before we get to the really exciting part, we have some stuff in Redux Toolkit that automatically detects things like accidentally mutating state, which is like the #1 mistake people have made with Redux over the years. Now, Immer, sorry.
Oh, is it Immer the magic there? Because I'm actually wondering how that's possible.
It's two things. One, Immer by itself actually makes mutations almost impossible because it's trapping your attempts to mutate data with the draft using proxies, and then it actually freezes your objects on the way out. But maybe you're not using Immer for certain slices, or maybe you are doing something kind of weird. It's actually kind of a brute force method. This mutation detection middleware like literally just recurses through your entire data structure and compares what was there before versus what's there now to figure out if you mutated something.
And at runtime, is it doing this?
It's doing it runtime in development mode only.
Okay. You anticipated my next question.
Yes. It is a relatively expensive check. Now, I did actually recently make some optimizations to this, where we make some assumptions that if a piece of state is frozen, we assume that everything inside of that is okay. And since most of your state should be frozen by Immer, we actually kind of just like bail out right away most of the time.
Gotcha.
Okay, now we get to the fun part. So I mentioned earlier that the React ecosystem has really focused on data fetching over the years. And you've always been able to use Redux for storing cache data from the server. It's just that we didn't provide anything built in for it. So you had to write all the thunks and the action types and the dispatching and the loading state and all that kind of stuff by hand. And even with things like createAsyncThunk, it's still kind of a pain. And that's why libraries like React Query have become so popular, is because they do all that work for you. And I've seen Tanner Lindsley, the creator of React Query, like retweeting people's comments where it's like, I switched to React Query and I draft 5,000 lines of code. And you know what? I believe it, because they probably did have a whole bunch of handwritten Redux logic for that. Well, my very, very talented and smart co-maintainers, Linz Weber and Matt Sikowski, started building a new piece for Redux Toolkit a few months ago, which we've called RTK Query. And it takes very obvious inspiration from libraries like React Query and Apollo and Urkel and SWR, but it puts a Redux-powered spin on this. So RTK Query is a data fetching abstraction and solution built on top of Redux Toolkit. And the idea is that you can define a few endpoints up front and it will do all the data fetching logic for you automatically. So it manages making the request, managing the loading state, storing the cache data, and updating your component to re-render as the cache state changes. Now, like the rest of Redux Toolkit, the core of this is actually entirely UI agnostic, and you can use it with any UI layer. We've had people use it with NGRX and Svelte and Vue and vanilla JS, but it also has some additional React specific behavior. So in theory, this could completely replace all of the data fetching logic in your Redux applications. Now, this is available right now in Redux Toolkit 1.6 beta, which you can install using the Redux Toolkit @next tag. And we are very, very, very close to having this done. We've got like a couple little tweak PRs left. The docs are basically filled out at this point, and everything is looking really, really good. So one other thing I want to show off real fast as far as usage. So typical usage pattern is that you would define one API slice per backend server that you're talking to. So like if I had like a REST API for a blog with like /blogs, /comment or /posts, comments, and users, you would define one API slice with multiple endpoint entries inside of it. Now, we don't have a normalized deduplicating cache. So if you make multiple requests that come back with similar data, it's actually going to cache each of those independently. Writing a deduplicating cache is a hard problem, and it's not something we have the interest or the time to tackle right now, but we think people will get a lot of value out of the functionality that's there. It is possible to have components extract small pieces of data out of the response. So I could fetch my 10,000 to-do entries in the parent list item and then have all the list items use the same query, but only grab out the one object that they care about. We've also added a couple really neat features. For example, there's a cache entry lifecycle capability where you could wait for the first component to start asking for this data. Once at least one component has the data, you could subscribe to a WebSocket on the back end, receive partial updates pushed over the WebSocket, update the cache with the received data, and then turn off the WebSocket once that no more components actually care about this. So I think that's going to be a very powerful piece of functionality that a lot of apps are going to benefit from. A couple other things real fast. As far as TypeScrypt usage, we actually recommend that most people try to use TypeScrypt with Redux today. And we've got some specific patterns that we found work particularly well. So first off, we now recommend that people try to export some inferred types for their root state and the dispatch method itself. And by inferring these from the store, you only have to set it up once. And then it automatically updates as you add like more reducer logic to your store. And that way you don't have to keep like hand editing the type definitions. We also recommend that most people try to define some pre-typed versions of the React Redux hooks and use these in the rest of your application instead of importing directly from React Redux into your components. And that way you're guaranteed to have the correct types for the state that you're reading or the attempts to actually dispatch something, and the usage is consistent across the code base. So in the slice files, the standard pattern is define what your state for that slice looks like, create an initial state value using that type, and then in your reducers, you declare that the actions are of type payload action with a generic indicating what the payload field itself actually contains. And then, like I said earlier, the action creators that are generated will have the corresponding type applied to the payload. Finally, in your components, you import those pre-typed hooks, and you can access the state and get all the error checking and the autocomplete and IntelliSense automatically, and everything should just line up correctly. And this is a lot simpler than some of the patterns we've seen people trying to use with Redux. So we actually have some Redux templates for Create React app available, and you can use them with either the -- template Redux or the -- template Redux TypeScrypt flags. And they both come with Redux Toolkit and the React Redux hooks already configured. And for the TypeScrypt one, it's got the hooks and the store types already being exported. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to ignore talking about the Redux documentation because I could talk about that for a while. And I actually want to show a little bit of running code, which is always nice. So the other day, I was on Jason Langsdorf's Learn with Jason stream. And we actually built a small Redux plus TypeScript application. So here's the typical Redux counter example. So I can click on this and I can increment. I can add a couple. I can click and adds after a delay. This does nothing because we have an even number. I can make it go up now. And if we look at the Redux dev tools, we should see a whole bunch of actions being dispatched. And here you can see the action types that I was talking about, where we've got action type names like counter/increment. So that should be pretty readable, but where did that come from? So let's look at the code over here, if I can find the correct window here. So here we have a counter slice written using Redux Toolkit and TypeScript. So we've got our counter state definition. And here we have our counter slice. So I've given it a reasonable name, counter. I have reducers that can actually mutate the state. So our state is an object with the data field nested inside. So I can mutate that in each of these different cases. Here, this one actually needs an action object. So I've declared that the action is a payload action that takes a number as its payload. And if I mouse over here, TypeScript knows that action.payload is in fact a number. And we've also got the ability to handle some additional action types from a thunk. And if we go down further, we're exporting those. We're writing some selectors, writing some thunks. And so all this logic is in one place. We also have the obligatory counter component where we are importing our pre-typed React Redux hooks. Here, I've got my selector. It's coming back and it knows that this is a number. We've got the dispatch function and all the stuff is just lining up okay. But counters are kind of boring. We want to fetch some data. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to import something that I put together earlier from /features dogs. Dogs
sound more fun.
Dogs are a lot more fun. And we're going to render a dogs list component here. And I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that I didn't break anything because I was messing with this like 3 minutes before I came on air.
As one does.
Hey, dogs.
Okay, so how did we just get those dogs to show up? Well, we're using RTK Query. Now, just for point of comparison, here's what this would have looked like if I'd written this code using Redux Toolkit before RTK Query. So I would have made like an Axios client, and I would have made a createAsyncThunk that fetches the data, and I would have made a slice, and I would have handled the fulfilled case, and I would have returned the data. And I probably should have had some loading state in there, and I should have updated the loading state before and after, and I probably should have had some error handling. This would actually be a lot longer if I'd done this the right way. Well, with RTK Query, this is the code. That's it. So I've got an API key. I've defined my API slice. And in here, I'm using RTK Query's fetch-based query. So we've got our own wrapper around fetch. And it lets me do things like provide the base URL for the API endpoint that I'm talking to, and setting some headers, because in this case, the dogs API wants an API key before I can run any parameterized queries. And I've defined one endpoint to fetch a list of different breeds of dogs. And the TypeScript types say that this returns an array of these breed descriptions. And the input is an optional number for how many of them I want to fetch. And since I'm using the React specific version of Create API, this automatically generated, okay, there's supposed to be better types there. I'm going to blame the TypeScript compiler. I probably just need to restart the type server, which we all do every 5 minutes anyway. But this automatically generated a React hook based on the endpoint that I defined. Okay, fine. Look, it knows what the endpoint is.
Yeah, I find sometimes VS Code is weird about this sort of thing too. We'll find different tools to blame, right? But sometimes I open and close the same file and it figures it out. So I don't know.
So in the actual component, then, all I have to do is import the useFetchBreeds query hook, call it, and I get back the data. And it knows, in fact, actually, if I take away this default value, it knows that this is an array of dog objects, or it's undefined because, the first time we render, we haven't made the request yet, therefore we don't have the data. So being a conscientious programmer, we fill in an empty array to make the rest of the code easier. And after that, it's just normal React rendering. I just loop over the array, spit out my table, and that's it. But one other thing we can see in here real fast. So I'm going to bring up the network tab here, and we're going to clear this out. And I'm going to try to do this live. So I'm going to change this to fetch 15 dogs. And we see that RTK query went off and it fetched some dogs, and the mock API responded to it. And then I'm going to go back to 10 dogs. Wait. Why didn't we see anything there? Well, we didn't see anything there because RTK query actually already had the data for both the fetch 15 and fetch 10 cases in cache. And when I switched from 10 to 15, it set a timer and said, well, no one cares about the 10 case anymore, but let's leave it around for a little while just in case anybody needs that soon. And so when I switched back to the 10 case, it still had it in cache, and I was able to just immediately supply it instead of having to refetch it. Now, if we wait just a little bit longer, we should actually see another action get dispatched where it should actually end up removing the 15 data from the store, because right now we're on 10, and so there's no active subscription for the yep, there we go. Remove result, and we look at the diff, and the 15 data went away because no one else was interested in that at this point.
So this prevents weird memory leaks.
Yep. By default, the subscriptions time out after 60 seconds of no one else having it. It's basically just a reference count. So if 5 components all want it, great. 4, 3, 2, 1, fine. When it goes to 0, we set the timer, and when the timer expires, remove the data. So I'm really, really excited about this, and I'm particularly excited by the number of people who have expressed interest in it, even during the alpha and the beta stages. And I think it's really going to simplify a lot of people's Redux code bases.
Yeah, I like this a lot. Actually, it reminds me of it's sort of a mashup of the good parts of React query put into a Redux world. I don't know if that makes.
No, that is literally what this is. I mean, we are very upfront, and we say in our docs, we took inspiration from the other libraries that have kind of pioneered this fetching hook style of API, but it's not all this was written from scratch, and we have put some very Redux specific API design into it.
Yeah, no, there's still like it's still got the reducer bits in it, like the sort of things that feel Reduxy, if that makes sense. So and I mean, it's an open source world, right? This is like how open source is supposed to work, like the good ideas. But I mean, Redux inspired a lot of solutions, and it just keeps the ball rolling.
Yeah, and like we've seen a lot of back and forth with like the NGRX library, which is basically Redux re-implemented for the Angular ecosystem. NGRX was inspired by Redux. They came up with that createEntityAdapter API first, and I ported it back to work with Redux Toolkit. They are now actually adding a new API called createFeature, which is basically createSlice. And they've actually looked at RTK Query and said, yeah, we can actually hook that into NGRX, basically as is. So I love seeing the inspiration going back and forth, and like we're all advancing the ecosystem in a friendly competition kind of a way.
Yeah, no, and like Immer as well, right? Like it's used by a couple different frameworks now, but it's just a solid thing that just makes things better for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So this has been a whole lot of fun. We have had a couple questions come in with the chat of people are interested in where the slides might be, and also like if people are interested in like RTK Query, where's the best place? Is there a good documentation page we can send people to?
So this talk is actually a variation on one I did just recently entitled "The State of Redux." And in fact, I will admit this is basically the same slides, ever so slightly modified. Yep. So basically, if you go to my blog, blog.isquaredsoftware.com, and you look at this State of Redux May 2021 link, it's basically the same slide set. And I will actually probably update this with the latest tweaks to it here momentarily. For RTK Query, the preview docs are currently linked from our beta release notes. I'll drop this in the side chat over here if you want to pass that on.
Yep.
But I'll spoiler alert for those watching. We were discussing this a little bit earlier. We are tentatively hoping to put this live early next week.
Nice.
Honestly, there's been almost no bug reports through the entire alpha process.
That's either happy or scary. You gotta tell me.
I know. It's like, okay, either nobody's using it or it works perfectly, and I know enough to know that it's probably not the latter. But no, it's been a very, very solid, smooth sailing all the way, and it's really just been about kind of like fleshing out the API to handle some additional use cases. So everything's looking good at this point, and I'm not immediately seeing anything that would prevent us from releasing it early next week.
Fantastic.
Well, cool, man. This has been really awesome. Are there any last links you want people to drop if people want to follow you, or is there anything else you want to plug here before we wrap up?
So I'm, like I said, I'm on Twitter and other places as @AceMarkE. My co-maintainers could use some attention. Lens Weber is let's see, Lens is @Fry. Matt is destroy with an underscore in the middle. Both of them are incredibly talented and have been doing a lot of work. I'll give a shout out to a guy on GitHub named Shrugsy, who has written the vast majority of this extensive RTK Query documentation over the last few weeks.
Documentation and open source contribution. Oh, yeah. That's amazing.
Hugely. No, like seriously, like if you look at the pull request list for RTK or like the last month and a half, it's just like this nonstop stream of docs PRs.
Yeah, that totally wasn't, I wasn't being sarcastic. Like getting open source contributions on docs, especially a lot of them, like that's gold right there.
I mean, that's how I got started. Like I got started with Redux by offering to write the FAQ page. And look at there's never enough docs.
Actually, that's my start in open source as well, was writing jQuery documentation. So it's actually like for anybody watching out here that wants to know how to get started, it's like if you if you go to the Redux GitHub and look like for an issue, it's going to be hard stuff, right? Like, because if it was an easy issue, Mark would like close it right away and do it, right?
not necessarily. So I actually filed I still want I've had an ongoing effort to transform the Redux core documentation for like the last couple years. And in all honesty, it's been going slow because I'm basically the only person putting effort into it. So, okay, so like what I actually didn't get to real fast, I've been working on trying to redo our docs. Last year, I wrote a brand new tutorial from scratch called the Essentials tutorial, which is kind of like the real world use Redux Toolkit intro. I also redid our like low level how all this works tutorial. That sucked up most of last year for me. And I've had other stuff going on this year. So I've got like dozens of open issues in the Redux repo that says, here's all the other doc stuff I want to do. I just haven't had time to do it. And I would love to have assistance with the rest of that stuff.
But we will put these links out there. Hopefully we will find you somebody. As we mentioned, it's an amazing way if you're looking to dip your toes into open source. Docs is like the easiest way to do it. So, yep. And it's super valuable. You reach like per the slide you showed earlier, Redux is used by, I think, like 20 trillion people. Like it's
give or take. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're actually like making like a real impact actually, because there's an astounding number of people that look at these sort of documentation pages. So
not as many as I would like. You'd be amazed at how many people avoid official docs.
Very true. Well, Mark, man, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for joining us and taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's been great.
So make sure to check out Redux Toolkit and RTK Query. So and look for an announcement hopefully next week.
Hopefully so. Wish us luck.
All right. See you, Mark. Oh, all right, Dan. We did it. We did all day.
All day.
I think the very last thing I'll call out is, if you found any of this interesting, if you're watching this live, if you're watching the recording, this is a stream Dan and I do every week. The same sort of format. We bring in cool people from the React world. We have them show us something cool. I've certainly learned a lot. I think, Dan, we say our guests are legit the coolest people. We've met some awesome people. Yep. And I think that's it. So thanks again so much for React Wednesdays all day. I really appreciate genuinely for everybody for joining us today. Until next time,